Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. A couple of days ago you might have seen our video on the best PC games of 2017, and if you haven't, there will be a link to watch it below. It's nice to talk about all the great games that were released this year, but we're also not going to let slide the games that really disappointed us. And there's a few that stick out this year like a sore thumb. Once again, we asked you guys what you thought were the most disappointing PC games of 2017, and we got a ton of responses. I've narrowed the list down to 5 worthy contenders, most of which I've personally played extensively, which I'll be going through in no particular order. And kicking it off this time is a doozy. Easily the most controversial game released in 2017, Star Wars Battlefront 2. When talking about Battlefront 2, I do want to mention that some aspects of this game are genuinely fun. The multiplayer gameplay itself is a blast, and the presentation captures the essence of Star Wars in such a brilliant way. There's a lot more content to enjoy than its predecessor 2, which was arguably a worse game in terms of its gameplay. But the problems with Battlefront 2 are numerous. The much hyped single player campaign is very short and just complete garbage. If I'm honest, it's actually not worth playing, and the multiplayer progression system is one of the worst in modern multiplayer shooters. It's confusing and unnecessarily complicated, with items, abilities and upgrades for both locked behind odd barriers. As a regular player, the progression system just doesn't feel rewarding and doesn't do a good job of incentivizing goals or unlocks. And let's not forget the pay to win system that EA nearly thrust on us all if it wasn't for the enormous outcry from the community. Loot crates you can buy with real money that give tangible in-game advantages to players have no place in competitive games. It's a disgraceful money grab, particularly when the game itself already costs $60 or more. And while EA did temporarily remove the ability to spend real money on loot crates at launch, there is no doubt you'll be able to pay to win at some point in the future. This would have been a good game if the progression system was completely reworked without the focus on pay to win mechanics. Instead, EA chased the dollary dues and ruined the hard work of the developers, much to their annoyance, I'm sure. Mass Effect Andromeda disappointed almost every Mass Effect fan. Looking back, I'm not quite sure why I played 50 hours of this game, because it really isn't that good. The main story in particular just wasn't that interesting and butchered what could have been a really interesting premise. It takes a long time to kick into gear as well. The best parts and most interesting worlds are reached after around a 15-hour opening slog, which no doubt led to many players giving up early into the game. My main issue with Andromeda is that in many ways it just didn't seem like a true Mass Effect game. The characters were weak, wooden and hard to care about, not helped by poor animation. The choices you made throughout the story seemed to have very little impact, and there weren't enough of them, and the game was also padded out with tons of boring fetch quests rather than compelling side stories, and it's side quests that make or break a strong RPG. A huge disappointment from EA and BioWare in the end, and there's no doubt that the game suffered from a horrible and painful development cycle. Middle-earth Shadow of War is a boring game. The story is boring, the combat is dull and repetitive, particularly if you played its predecessor, Shadow of Mordor, and the ending is downright disgraceful. Oh, and there's lots of loot boxes with microtransactions too to enjoy, just to cap off one of 2017's great disappointments. It's a real shame Shadow of War turned out in such a mediocre state, because Shadow of Mordor was a fantastic, innovative game that could have led to an interesting, equally inventive sequel. Instead, Shadow of War is basically a stretched out Shadow of Mordor with a couple of minor gameplay additions. Siege battles are a lot of fun, by far the best aspect of the game, and it was nice to see a larger variety of environments, but the Nemesis system feels stale and the story isn't interesting in the slightest. And let's take a moment to talk about the ending. For no other reason than to pad out the game and incentivize loot crate purchases, Shadow of War gives you 20 consecutive fortress defenses of increasing difficulty. 20! It's a 5+ hour repetitive grind. You're better off just watching the final cutscene it unlocks on YouTube. I'm not sure who thought this ending was a good idea, but it's a disgusting finish to a very disappointing AAA game of 2017. Everyone's least favorite game publisher has entered this list for a third time with Need for Speed Payback. So I guess it's congratulations EA for having 3 of 2017's most disappointing games. In fact, I'm not quite sure why EA continues to make Need for Speed games, as it feels like the last decade of entries has been subpar. Payback could be the worst entry yet. The story is laughably bad with terrible characters, though I guess that isn't all that surprising for a racing game. The worst part of Payback is that it's not a very satisfying driving experience, especially compared to the better racing games of 2017, and it compounds that with grind-filled gameplay and a bad upgrade system. It's the last racing game you should play in 2017 if you're a fan of the genre, and to be honest, EA should retire the series for a while if it can't make good entries anymore. Wait, what? You might be wondering why we've put PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds in our most disappointing games list, especially after we also included it in our best games list of the year. Well, before you start slamming the dislike button, PUBG was one of the games you guys heavily nominated for both the best and worst PC game of 2017, particularly on Twitter. It's also a great example of a game that gets a lot of things right, but lets down players in other areas. One of the key issues with PUBG is optimization. The game is not the prettiest, and for some reason, even with the latest release, runs surprisingly poorly on a range of hardware. AMD users are hit the hardest whether they have Ryzen CPUs or Radeon GPUs, and while those with Nvidia Intel systems fare a bit better, the frame rates you get out of this game aren't great, to say the least. It was easy to forgive PUBG for these issues in early access, but despite a large development team and plenty of resources, the game is still poorly optimized even at the official launch. PUBG also suffers from technical issues and bugs, many of which seem connected to the network code. Stuttering and rubber banding is reasonably common, at least the last time I jumped in, and there's also problems like texture pop-in and random graphical glitches. PUBG still needs a fair bit of work to improve how it performs, though the current technical problems are not exactly going to stop people from playing. It's a ton of fun despite the problems, that's for sure. And I guess it's time to go into some dishonorable mentions, I'd guess you'd have to call them. You guys nominated a number of other games for most disappointing, including things like Call of Duty World War II, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Wildlands, Lawbreakers, Agents of Mayhem, which I was looking forward to and just didn't seem to be that good in the end, and even Destiny 2. So there was no shortage of games that failed to live up to the hype in 2017, at least in your guys' eyes. Maybe nothing quite as bad as the No Man's Sky disaster of 2016, though loot boxes and microtransactions certainly dominated discussions this year. Hopefully a lot of the games we are all looking forward to next year don't turn out as disappointing as some of this year's titles I've just been talking about. If there's anything we've missed, I'm sure you'll let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to check out our Patreon as well. Links to that are in the description below if you feel like supporting us, and I'll catch you next time.